All right, here. This is probably the proper beginning of the chronological bookshelves. This is more or less chronological, with some exceptions. On the top, this is pretty self-explanatory. This is starting with a general history of the American Revolution, going through a couple of books by Gordon Wood, very well-known historian of the colonial and early American Republic days. Two-volume biography of George Washington, John Adams by Page Smith. The Adams-Jefferson letters, very fascinating, their correspondence. Book on Aaron Burr, various other lesser-known figures of the time. A book on Henry Clay. This actually took a while to find. This is a biography of Chief Justice Roger Taney, a much-hated figure in American history. He's the man that wrote the Dred Scott decision. Not a popular guy, but...
Did he succeed Marshall?
Yes, I believe he did. I believe he came after him and served all the way into Lincoln's time. And I think this book is somewhat sympathetic to him, and I'm curious to read more about his life of a man that is not one of the great heroes of American history. Book on the political theory of John C. Calhoun. Interesting book in the sense that he was a real political thinker with some unusual political theories.
I've heard it described by a person who is somewhat familiar with Calhoun, that he was almost a Marxist in terms of economic analysis, but the difference was he regarded this as a just and fair way, that the political economy that came about through massive wealth and consolidation of political power, he considered that to be just and right. That was sort of God's plan.
I think that's essentially right. He believed in the classes, and he believed in representing classes in the formal governmental structure. You would have a permanent representative of, like, the plantation class, the mercantile class. The slaves would not be represented. But you would restructure American government that way, and that would be more fair, because you would acknowledge that there's a class system, and you would find some way for everyone to have some kind of representation, as opposed to pretending that everyone is the same. That's what he would accuse the people that didn't agree with him of feeling. And he had a very elaborate theory of that, and it's still talked about today. Just finishing up on that shelf. Short biography of Polk, American Lion, Thomas Jefferson. This is a curious book that actually I had to trade a lot of books to get. It's a book on the anti-Masonic movement, which is really very fascinating. It's one of the first great conspiracy theory-based political movements in the country. And the thing that really makes it fascinating is that it was precipitated by a murder which actually happened of a man that opposed the Masons. And more, famous people here. Daniel Webster. These are recent books. These are recent studies of these historical figures. Salmon Chase, Winfield Scott. This row here, and by the way, I should point out this is double shelved, so there's a whole row of books behind it. We won't go into that. It's just too difficult. This is all the American Statesman series, which was kind of groundbreaking for its time. It was published from the 1880s through, I think, the 19s. And they were short biographies of various famous American political leaders. Some of them written by famous people. There's, for instance, a biography of Thomas Hart Benton by Theodore Roosevelt. Biographies by Henry Cabot Lodge, other well-known people who were politicians themselves. And this has been amassed through various bookstores and library sales. As you can see, there are different colors. Some of that represents different editions. Moving down, this is a multi-biography biography of George Washington, written by John Marshall, actually. That came from a library sale in Apollo, Pennsylvania. Various other things related to the early days. A lot of books here, a number of books here, I should say, on Thomas Jefferson, who has recently interested me a great deal. And there's more Jefferson books scattered elsewhere in the collection. Aaron Burr, Madison and Monroe. Down here, Tecumseh, the great Indian leader, I hate to say it, but there are very few books here that are not by white males. They're not about them. There are a number of books by authors that are not white males, but there's a predominance of that. But here's one about a great Native American leader. This is a 2-volume biography, kind of a classic of John Marshall. Henry Adams' multi-volume book about the Jefferson and Madison administrations condensed into a modern edition. Otherwise it would be much bigger. Various other figures of the era, John Quincy Adams. These are all a number of smaller books that were published in the 19th century. This is a favorite of mine. This is an old collection of speeches and writings of a famous attorney and statesman named Rufus Choate. I believe that's how his name is pronounced. Addresses and orations of Rufus Choate. And he was an orator of the old school, and in this book is a eulogy of Daniel Webster, where there is a sentence that takes 10 minutes to read out loud. I have to confess I haven't gotten through it, but that's impressive. 10 minutes for one sentence. Those were the good old days.
Is that the Choate of Choate Rosemary Hall prep school fame, do you know?
I bet it is. I bet it's the same family, because he was very much of a part of the patrician class. Various other political figures of the early 19th century, Samuel Houston, Silas Wright, Andrew Jackson, a couple of Jackson biographies. Here's more on Calhoun, Martin Van Buren, one of the few biographies of William Henry Harrison. Lasted 1 month in the presidency, right there. John Tyler.
That's a plum. That's a plum find.
Yeah, this is a reprint, but still, you don't see them reprinted or otherwise. That came from a library sale. A book on the American Whig Party, published about 15 years ago. Great book, if you want that sort of thing. Lewis Cass, Millard Fillmore. Hard to get Millard Fillmore biographies. Franklin Pierce, Charles Sumner, the great crusading senator. And I might also turn your attention to, this is sort of like the deep storage shelf department here of various books relating to these sorts of topics, more obscure politicians.
Well, there's a woman subject.
Yes, that she's a diarist. She's actually the diarist. She's writing about probably men mostly, but it's a Washington diary. So that gives you a sense of that. Moving along, we're on the other side of the B. Gratz Brown room, and before talking about the books, I wanted to call attention to another framed picture. This is another cartoon from Puck magazine. This is from 1880, and it is a fanciful representation of the political figures of the day as characters in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And if you know something about the period, you can kind of make heads or tails of what's going on. For instance, Charles Ingersoll, the famous atheist, is being wooed by Henry Ward Beecher, a liberal preacher of the day, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the suffragette, hovering over as a butterfly, consecrating this rather unnatural union here. And the two presidential candidates of the election, James Garfield and Winfield Scott Hancock, are dreamers, while all this various silliness is going on. And up here we have Roscoe Conkling, a rather vain politician dressed as a witch in drag, flying on his broomstick. And we'll be talking about Mr. Conkling very soon. Moving down here, this here is the namesake. This is who the room is named for. That's the Honorable B. Gratz Brown, a governor of Missouri in the 19th century. And the reason why he happens to be the person honored by this room is that a person I know was talking about B. Gratz Brown, just delighting in the name, and it seemed like that'd be a good name for this library. A very hirsute fellow, as many of his peers were. There's a few books piled up here that need to be processed. One I would mention kind of for special attention is a really interesting book I picked up about a month ago called The Flush Times of Alabama and Mississippi. This was published in 1858, and it's considered a precursor to Mark Twain's writings. It's a series of satires about the various scams and ludicrous behavior of lawyers in the Deep South during the time. Kind of broad American humor, talking about, cultural trends of the era. All right, now, up here. This, I have to say, is some of my favorite stuff here. This is the stuff that I really enjoy. This is getting into the kind of hardcore elements of this collection. A lot of older books here. This is getting into the Civil War era. What we have here is a number of campaign biographies. This is an old one, for instance, for President James Buchanan. And here's a picture of the president. The old public functionary is what he called himself. And from the same election, I also have a campaign biography of his opponent, the first Republican candidate for president, John Charles Fremont. Very dashing fellow, an explorer, and was actually picked by the Republican Party because he symbolized youth and energy. And there's a wonderful quote about Colonel Fremont by people that didn't care for him that said he possessed all the attributes of genius except ability. He had a kind of unfortunate rocky rest of his life after he ran for president. Let's see, old biographies of William Henry Seward. The Life of Thurlow Weed. I was very happy when I finally acquired these two volumes. Thurlow Weed was a political boss of the 19th century. Maybe you might say he was like the Karl Rove of his day. He was the man behind Seward's career, and also was involved with Lincoln as well.
And who was he a boss for? Was he a city boss? Or
He was the boss of the state of New York for the Whig Party. He controlled the patronage and marshaled the troops for the Whigs, and also extended into the Republican era as well. Moving down to the next shelf, a recent biography of John Brown, along with a classic early biography of him. I actually have a number of books of him that are kind of behind here that you can't see. These are a 2-volume set of 30 Years in the Senate by Thomas Hart Benton, who was a prominent senator before the Civil War. And here we get into a number of books about Abraham Lincoln. This is a standard biography of him from the 1920s by Albert Beveridge, who was a former senator. Very nice condition set of those books, and very good read. More Lincoln books, book on John C. Breckinridge, who was one of his opponents in the 1860 election. By the way, this is a biography, or actually the autobiography of Carl Schurz, who was a general during the Civil War, and takes a very nice picture, you must admit.
Which side was he a general on?
On the Union side. He was actually a German immigrant who had fought for German unification in 1848, and he fled when the revolution failed and became a very prominent American politician for a long time.
Oh. And the Breckinridge ended up being a Confederate general, did he not?
He did. Yes, he did. Yes, after being Vice President of the United States. I read the biography of Breckinridge, and apparently at one point he was considering moving to Iowa. If he had moved to Iowa as a young man, his whole story would have been different. Such is life. More Lincoln-related stuff, various cabinet officers. Here's another good-looking fellow, John Bigelow, who was actually the author of one of those biographies of Fremont, a very noble, public-spirited citizen with a fine set of sideburns. Lived a long time, too.
No relation to Bigelow Boulevard.
No, that's another Bigelow. An old book on the Civil War by Horace Greeley. Here's an old memoir of General Benjamin F. Butler,
Was he the military governor of South Carolina?
Louisiana, of New Orleans, actually.
New Orleans.
Butler. He was accused of stealing spoons from the townspeople, and when he would campaign for office years later, people would dangle spoons in front of him.
Okay.
He was...
Wasn't he widely considered to be incompetent?
Yeah, kind of, because he was a civilian who became a general. He was also thought of as being corrupt and fanatical at times, but an interesting man, and strangely enough, he fought for the working man at times when no politician would. So he's kind of a problematic figure. Very interesting. There's another Butler book. Books on George McClellan, including McClellan's memoirs. He was the first commander of the Union forces in the East, and not very successful at it. Here's a four...
Oh, wait.
Yes.
Sickles, who was a corps commander at Gettysburg.
Oh, yes. And who shot his wife, though not at Gettysburg, and got off, too.
Well, at least he separated the violence.
That wouldn't go over so well today, but somehow he got off. But colorful character. This is a 4-volume biography of Robert E. Lee by Douglas Freeman, kind of a standard work of its time. Life of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, another rather noble, or I should say controversial, Confederate commander.
Founder of the Ku Klux Klan,
Yes, he was. So various other Civil War-related books by well-known and not so well-known people. This is the kind of thing that you can get at a library sale if you're really vigilant. This is an autobiography of Oliver Otis Howard, O.O. Howard, who was actually the first head of the Freeman's Bureau, and I believe Howard University is named for him.
Oh.
He was a Civil War general and also a crusader for African American rights early on, and I bought those for $1 each at a book sale, and rather obscure book.
Okay.
Down here, more Civil War generals, various politicians, the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant, which every collection of this sort should have. Those are kind of a classic. More recent biography of Ulysses S. Grant. Horace Greeley, the great journalist and election opponent of Grant in 1872. And the collection continues along similar lines on the final shelf. Various other assorted politicians ranging from Charles Francis Adams to Boss Tweed to Hannibal Hamlin, Lincoln's first vice president, to Boss Crocker.
I have to say that when you first talked about Thurlow Weed,
Yes.
the name Boss Tweed came to mind, particularly since you said that Thurlow Weed was also a boss, but at a New York State level as opposed to a New York City level.
I don't know if Tweed and Weed ever came to blows politically, but that would be very musical if they had. But I'm not sure that they have. They ever did. But anyway.
So it seems like this whole shelf then is quite thematic because it's sort of the immediate pre-Civil War, the antebellum, if you will, period, going through the heart of it, at least in the biographical sense.
Yes.
And then to the immediate post-war period, including the U.S. Grant memoirs. Do they talk about his presidency?
Yes, it's really his whole life, although they're considered most valuable because of the very exact, dispassionate way that he describes his war experiences. In fact, believe it or not, Gertrude Stein was a fan of the memoirs because of the sort of precise, objective way that they were written. They're not written in the kind of flowery, sort of morally infused style that you get in typical memoirs of that era.
So he wrote like he was a general, sort of straight ahead.
Yes, that's right, that's right.
He will plow you over with verbiage.
He did not do that, no. One other interesting thing I'll point out before moving on is that this is an example of how the history of the time that these books are written about varies by when these history books were written. For instance, this biography of Andrew Johnson is from, I think, the 30s, and it's very sympathetic to him. He was the the man who succeeded Lincoln, of course, and fought Reconstruction, fought more assertive efforts to enfranchise the freed slaves. And this book is sympathetic to Johnson. Now, a few years later, you get this biography of Thaddeus Stevens, who was Johnson's mortal enemy, and until probably around the 1950s, in the 20th century at least, was just regarded as this vicious fanatic who just hated the South and wanted to grind it down, into submission, and supported the corrupt carpetbagger administrations. But this book is sympathetic to him and says that really he was being realistic, and he was trying to help African Americans who he genuinely sympathized with. And this kind of opinion you wouldn't have gotten much earlier than the 1950s, especially from, say, the 1890s through the 1940s. History just would not have been viewed that way. So by reading different books from different periods about different subjects, you get these shifting perspectives. You can see that times change in terms of how our history is regarded. I should point out that because of space limitations, some of the overflow of books end up on this very top shelf. And these are books that are really supplemental to the books that are lower down. There's more books about the Civil War, Fremont, John Brown, Lincoln, quite a few about Lincoln actually, more recent ones, a more modern biography of Grant. And I would point out also, this is considered the modern classic biographies of Thomas Jefferson by Dumas Malone, a 6-volume set. I've read 2 of them, as well as other biographies of Jefferson. And on top of top of those are some paperbacks about slavery and more about Jefferson, including 2 really fascinating books about Jefferson: The Jefferson Image in the American Mind, and The Lost World of Thomas Jefferson, which deals with his scientific ideas. Now, here we are in books that really start around the 1870s, and this is the part of the collection that probably needs the most defense on my part, because many people would say it spends way too long on the Gilded Age leading up to World War I, that this is like concentrating in too much detail on now forgotten American politicians, but I have to confess that that's the stuff that I really like. For whatever reason, I'm very much of a student of that era, and I really can't get enough books about the political denizens of that time. So, that being said, we have biography of Rutherford B. Hayes, Chester Arthur, a good amount about James Garfield, including a collection of his works. And that's a little more justifiable than for some presidents, because he was a very well-educated man. He was the president of a college, Hiram College, I believe, in Ohio, and a pretty articulate fellow. So he reads a little better than some.
Now, I must ask, Garfield famously assassinated.
Yes.
The standard blurb that you get from the encyclopedic type history is he was assassinated by a disgruntled job seeker.
Yes.
Do you believe that to be an accurate description of his assassination?
As best as I can determine from what I've read, he was shot by a deranged individual who really had no significant political connections, but identified with one faction of the Republican Party. Garfield had gotten into a squabble with a group of Republicans called the Stalwarts, who are well represented in this collection, by the way. And Charles Guiteau, the assassin, took offense for some reason and decided to shoot Garfield, making Chester Arthur, who is considered a stalwart, president. And much to the surprise of many people, when Arthur became president, he didn't unduly favor the stalwarts, and in fact tried to be a fairly honorable president and was considered a halfway decent one. Biographies of Winfield Scott Hancock, who was Garfield's opponent. A couple of books on James G. Blaine, who was one of the great factional leaders of the Republican Party, a split between Blaine and the stalwart leader Conkling really is the backstory to why Garfield got assassinated, because there was a lot of political turmoil. To show you how minute this sort of thing can get, this is a book called the Conkling and Blaine Fry Controversy in 1866. You're not going to see that in many collections. This is the story of why the two Republican leaders, Conkling and Blaine, got into a personal squabble that extended for years and years. Let's see. Well, I'll just show the book plate. It's from this old library. And it's written by somebody who was a party to that squabble. You have to be really into this sort of stuff to want a book like that in your collection, and of course I do. President Grover Cleveland, 3-volume biography of Benjamin Harrison. There are not many biographies of Benjamin Harrison. That, by the way, is a pretty scarce book. One of those books cost me $1, and 2 of those books cost me 50 cents each. Those come from book sales and used bookstores. Moving down to the second shelf, more hardcore political stuff from the 1880s. This is a favorite of mine. This is The Life and Letters of Roscoe Conkling, who, as I pointed out, was depicted as the witch in drag in this Puck cartoon. He was a very vain and powerful political figure of his day. This is a collection of his writings and speeches, and it's in remarkably good condition. Really a beautiful book from the 1880s, published just after his death. More Conkling, various reminiscences, autobiography of Andrew D. White, who was one of the founders of Cornell University, Benjamin Foraker, powerful senator, biography of McKinley, and more of the same here. Now we're getting into populism, various memoirs of the 1890s. This is a book I acquired recently. This is another political memoir, but one reason I like it is because of its very colorful embossed cover. The Memoirs of John Sherman, brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, and a politician of many years standing in many offices.
Was he a politician prior to William Tecumseh Sherman's military career?
He was a politician prior to William Tecumseh Sherman's service in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. They were more or less contemporaries in age, I think. I forget who was younger, but their careers kind of paralleled each other, although General Sherman died maybe about 10 years or so earlier than his brother.
Now, it was Sherman who famously said that if he was nominated, he would not run, and if he was elected, he would not serve.
That's right.
Correct?
That's right, and he apparently meant it, because he never did run for office.
But his brother was indeed part of the formal elected political system.
Oh yes, he was a Treasury Secretary, a Senator, a Secretary of State, Congressman, just in office a long, long time.
What state was he associated with?
Ohio.
Ohio.
Yes.
Okay.
Many of the politicians here, including a number of the presidents, are from Ohio, which was called the mother of presidents in those times.
I thought that was Virginia.
Well, that was okay, you're right, but it was one of the second mother of presidents.
Okay.
During the 19th century, a lot of Republicans came from Ohio. It was really kind of the nurturing ground of them.
Now, one other thing, the Sherman Antitrust Act.
Yes.
Was that passed by the John Sherman?
Yeah, he wrote it, yes.
He wrote it.
Yes.
Okay.
So his name is on a number of pieces of famous legislation. He was a big deal. He was aced out of being he was aced out of his Senate seat because Mark Hanna, biography of Hanna up here, wanted it. Mark Hanna was the boss behind McKinley. And then finally they kind of got rid of old John Sherman because he wasn't strong enough of an imperialist. He wasn't a big supporter at all of the Spanish-American War, so he was kind of inconvenient, so they kind of moved him out of the job and into the pasture. So here we get into some books. Here's several books about Eugene V. Debs, who definitely belongs here. Fascinating guy. William Jennings Bryan, including the most recent book on Bryan. Various other political memoirs. The now classic biographies of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris. Theodore Roosevelt's own autobiography is there.
Well, now here's a question.
Yes.
Are you interested in another William Jennings Bryan biography? Because I have one called Defender of the Faith.
I believe I have it.
Okay.
It's in the archives behind here.
Okay. All right. Right.
Yes, but thank you for that.
So you stack your archives by subject then? So
I'm afraid, you see, you're getting into the kind of the poignant aspect of this collection, which is not enough space. Now, theoretically, if you had too much space, things would just get grotesquely unwieldy, but there is a sort of a sad aspect to just not having enough for what your purposes are.
I think that the solution is, given where we live and the inexpensiveness of real estate, you should buy a neighboring house for the library.
I don't think that would help my domestic relations, even if it was economically feasible. But, you know, to be fair, I mean, obviously I've had enough room to get into some pretty esoteric things. Like, for instance, here's a book on the California Progressives, the Progressive Party of California. There's a lovely little picture of Hiram Johnson in the middle of a sun, and everyone should have a book about Hiram Johnson in their collection. This is a book which you are probably familiar with, The Triumph of Conservatism.
Gabriel Coco.
Right, which talks about Theodore Roosevelt not being the great crusading liberal that some hold him to be. All right, moving down, more 19th, early 20th century, including some books on powerful people that are little remembered today, like Uncle Joe Cannon, the very powerful Speaker of the House. There's a biography of William Randolph Hearst, fairly recent one. A couple of biographies of William Howard Taft. Getting into Woodrow Wilson here. Woodrow Wilson, collection of some of his early writings. A biography of him. And down to the last shelf here, a memoir of a Woodrow Wilson cabinet officer. The Recollections of Thomas R. Marshall. Thomas R. Marshall was the man that said, what this country needs is a good 5-cent cigar. He was a wag, an Indiana politician, and kind of a jokester. And this book is a bit lighthearted in tone. 2-volume biography of Charles Evans Hughes, the Supreme Court Justice and presidential candidate. This is kind of a mixed section here. We've got some books about journalists and editors of the late 19th and early 20th century, including Henry J. Raymond, the founder of the New York Times, History of the New York Tribune. This is a book by William Allen White, a very well-known journalist of his day, called Masks and a Pageant, and I pull this out just because this book is a favorite of mine. It's the story of the various political figures that he knew and wrote about, written in a very colorful way. And here we're getting into some Supreme Court justices, including Oliver Wendell Holmes. This is a recent biography of Oliver Wendell Holmes, which I highly recommend, called Justice from Beacon Hill. And I also have a collection of his writings called The Mind and Faith of Justice Holmes. Very interesting collection of work. Right, now we're slowly moving into more modern times. I just should point out that on the top shelf here, it's a similar arrangement as elsewhere, in the sense that these are books that might belong a little earlier in the collection, but there just wasn't space for them, including biography of John Hay, the Secretary of State, early biography of Theodore Roosevelt, various things of Franklin Roosevelt as well. All right, moving down here.
But no biography of Colin Hay.
No. The Men at Work section is another part of the house. Very fine portrait of Warren Harding, and one of the few books I have that are really sympathetic to Warren Harding. He got a bad press. Various more political books. This here in the corner is the memoirs of Will Hayes, a name you might remember from the Hayes office. He was in charge of the Hollywood censorship system as well as being a Republican politician. These are all various damaging and rather critical biographies of Warren Harding about his various crimes and things. Calvin Coolidge, including a book from Regnery Press, the conservative viewpoint represented on Calvin Coolidge here. 2-volume biography of Robert M. La Follette.
Now, one moment. Did you have any Woodrow Wilson?
Yes, we had that earlier.
I'm sorry, I must have missed that. I must have spaced out.
We do have Wilson down here, of course.
Okay.
Let's see if there's anything worth pointing out behind here. John W. Davis, several books on John W. Davis, Coolidge's opponent in 1924. You have to have that.
Davis was a Democrat, of course.
He was a rather conservative Democrat, and he was the man that was picked after 103 ballots in the notorious 1924 Democratic Convention that lasted 2 weeks, 2 excruciating weeks. And later on he became he was a very well-known lawyer, and he practiced for some years after that.
How much did he lose the general election by?
He carried the South, essentially. Mm-hmm. And Coolidge got the rest, and La Follette, running as a third-party candidate, carried Wisconsin. So it was kind of a blowout for Coolidge. This is a little subsection on the Prohibition movement and the Prohibition Party. This is a very curious book. This is called Cyclopedia of Temperance and Prohibition. This is an entire encyclopedia of various subjects, all devoted to things related to the banning of alcoholic beverages, including legislation, Ireland, the history, various political figures, druggists, drunkenness. For someone that was really into the subject back in the 1890s, this would be a pretty good book. Reminiscences of Neil Dow, one of the founders of the temperance movement in the 1890s, or the 1850s, actually. Memoir of Frances Willard, the founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And various books about Prohibition and the Prohibition Party. Okay, moving on. Al Smith, Herbert Hoover, Norman Thomas, the great socialist leader, Fiorello LaGuardia, mayor of New York, and then a lot of books about Franklin Roosevelt. The Arthur Schlesinger classic study of the New Deal, a recent book by Conrad Black, who may still be in prison, I don't know if he is. The media mogul wrote about Franklin Roosevelt.
What was he in prison for?
I don't know. I should know this. Taxes, something like that.
It's always a good choice.
Yes.
Did Norman Thomas ever run for president?
6 times.
I'm guessing he never won.
No, he was very well regarded. He was thought of as a humanitarian. He was a socialist, but not thought of as being a bomb thrower. Thought of as a very humane, decent man who, unfortunately, was a socialist. So.
And when was his era? I'm guessing from the place in the 20s, 30s, 40s.
The 20s through the 40s.
Yeah.
He first ran in 1928. And he last ran in 1948.
Okay.
So he kept at it. More Roosevelt-related books, including a couple of recent ones, kind of diametrically opposed. This is a conservative critique of the New Deal, The Forgotten Man by Amity Shlaes. The name might be pronounced. Nothing to Fear by Adam Cohen. So kind of both perspectives. Various other New Deal era figures here. Huey Long, Thomas Dewey. Yeah. Collection of speeches by the notorious Father Coughlin. Bought in Ford City, Pennsylvania for $1. Mr. Republican, Robert Taft, Douglas MacArthur, and the famous Harry Truman biography by David McCullough.
Now, who the heck was Alfalfa Bill?
This man took a good picture. This man, I'm glad you brought that out, pointed that out. I'll give this picture here. Wouldn't you like that man in the White House?
Man, he looks a lot like, I'm gonna forget his name, the cowboy from The Big Lebowski. Sam Elliott.
Yeah, he
Looks like
does
Sam
actually.
Elliott.
You're right, he does. With a little Harry Dean Stanton thrown in, maybe.
Yeah.
He was governor of Oklahoma in the 30s, and his slogan for running for president was bread, butter, bacon, and beans. I mean, that man laid it on the line. No metaphysics there.
I'm glad to see he didn't get into any aspects of industry or anything else. He just kept it all food.
Yes, he did, but he didn't get too far. He ran against FDR in 1932, but he got a book written about himself, and there it is.
So Hoover didn't run in 32?
Yes, he did, and was beaten by FDR.
But Alfalfa Bill must have run in 36 then?
No, he ran in the primaries against Roosevelt.
Oh, he's a Democrat. Okay.
Yes, he was a Democrat.
It's so funny that there's an anachronism. I always associate Oklahoma with Republicans.
At one time, it was heavily Democratic because it was considered the South or semi the South.
Well, and indeed, Howard Zinn in his People's History of the United States notes that in the teens and or 20s, Oklahoma legislature actually had a majority of socialists.
That might be an exaggeration, but I do know they did have socialist office holders, and in fact, a few of their counties went for Eugene V. Debs in 1912. They definitely was a radical tradition in Oklahoma. That's true.
The shame of Oklahoma.
It's pretty hard to find now. Speaking of radicals, this is a wonderful book. This biography of Henry Wallace, which was co-written by a former Iowa Senator, John Culver. Really fascinating story, very well written. And I have, to go along with this, I have a biography of Henry Wallace's running mate for vice president on the progressive ticket. This fellow here,
Glenn Taylor.
Glenn Taylor was a singing cowboy who got himself elected to the Senate from Idaho and ran with Wallace on a left-wing Progressive Party ticket in 1948 and suffered an ignominious defeat, obviously.
Did they carry any states?
No.
Okay.
No, and in fact, they got pelted with eggs in the South for their trouble. They were not well treated. A number of books about Adlai Stevenson and the Stevenson family. Earl Warren. A book about Pat and Jerry Brown, which brings up the point that there really should be a modern biography of Jerry Brown. There's nothing that's been written about him in book form since the 1970s.
Wow, that's the father of the current governor, correct?
No, Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown, there's no modern biography of him.
The current governor?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There should be. Various other senators of interest, Ernest Gruning and Wayne Morris. They're together because you might remember that those are the only two senators that voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
What states were they from?
Alaska and Oregon.
Wow. All the rain got to their brain.
I think so. Paul Douglas, the liberal senator from Illinois. Robert Caro's first book on Robert Moses, the power broker.
Yeah.
You can see we're getting into more modern times here. Oh, don't forget Strom Thurmond, a Strom Thurmond biography. You must have that.
Oh, Strom.
Biography of William O. Douglas, a Supreme Court justice. Now, here we're getting into a conceptual decision that I had to make. We're getting to the civil rights era, and what I did is I put books that go back to the times of slavery in with books about the civil rights struggle in the 20th century. And as part of that, I have a number of books about and by W.E.B. Du Bois, who is an absolutely fascinating figure and very much deserves to be in this collection, but this is where I chose to put him. Along with Taylor Branch's Parting the Waters on the Civil Rights Movement, biography of Adam Clayton Powell, and Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, which is considered a really pioneering study of African Americans in the 20th century. All right, going down to the next shelf, we have we're getting into the latter part of the 20th century with various political figures, including a book on President Kennedy by Richard Reeves, and the wonderful Robert Caro biographies, the first 3 volumes of his books on Lyndon Johnson. Mike Mansfield, George Wallace, Mayor Daley of Chicago, Rick Perlstein's excellent book on the 1964 election, Before the Storm, and this is something I must confess I bought online. This is sort of a special sort of guilty pleasure, a biography of Sam Yorty, the mayor of Los Angeles in the 1960s, a perennial office seeker and sort of a wily politician, slightly ridiculous but sort of fascinating in his own way. And Robert Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, various other books about politics in the 60s and 70s. Two excellent books about Nixon, Nixon Agonistes by Gary Wills and Nixonland by Rick Perlstein. These here, for instance, these are not well-known books, but these are really fascinating. This is a book by a statistician and public opinion poll analyst, Albert Menendez, analyzing the Ross Perot vote in 1992. Very interesting breakdown of who voted for Perot and why, and another book by the same author about the evangelical vote. Okay, now we're wending our way to the end of the 20th century. There is Edmund Morris's kind of quasi-biography of Ronald Reagan, Dutch. There's a copy of Thomas Frank's What's the Matter with Kansas. And we have a bunch of general studies about elections and political parties. The Democrats, the Republicans, and some more regional sorts of things. This is a classic book here, not often seen in hardback, The Mind of the South by W.J. Cash. And a recent book about the American South called There Goes My Everything, which deals with the Civil Rights era. And okay, here's another charming book, The Rise and Fall of the American Left. So we have just sort of general books about government and political behavior down here.